February 14th, 1943, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Marine Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh secures himself in the confined space of his F4U Corsair's cockpit. The morning sun casts a gleam upon the unmistakable curved wings of his fighter. Around him, fellow Marines are fastening themselves into their own aircraft, readying for what would later be termed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Unbeknownst to them at this moment, this particular day would signify a critical shift in the Pacific War. It would be the day when Japanese aviators would cease to mock the peculiar new American fighter with its crooked wings. Merely a few months prior, upon the initial arrival of the Corsairs in the Pacific theater, seasoned Japanese Zero pilots had regarded the awkward-looking American aircraft with something akin to mirth. The bent-wing fighter appeared ungainly, almost as if it were a mere experiment. Its elongated nose extended far beyond the cockpit, lending it an odd, unbalanced appearance when contrasted with the elegant, flowing lines of their cherished Mitsubishi, a 6M0. The F4U seemed more like a creation born from a committee's deliberation than the meticulous craftsmanship of engineers who understood the art of flight. However, appearances, as the Japanese were to discover at their own detriment, could be profoundly misleading. The narrative of how the F4U Corsair transformed from an apparent oddity into the most dreaded American fighter in the Pacific commences in 1938 within the offices of the United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. The Navy had issued one of its characteristically stringent requests for proposals. They sought a single-engine fighter capable of achieving speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, possessing a stalling speed below 70 miles per hour, and a range of 1,000 miles. The aircraft was to be armed with 4 machine guns or 3 guns with additional ammunition, supplemented by bombs carried beneath each wing. In essence, the Navy desired a machine that could fly rapidly, traverse long distances, operate from carriers, and deliver devastating damage. At Chance Vought Corporation in Stratford, Connecticut, Chief Engineer Rex Basel reviewed these stipulations and made a decisive choice. Rather than compromise on any aspect of performance, he resolved to construct the fighter around the largest and most potent engine available at the time, the formidable Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp radial engine. This colossal power plant generated over 2,000 horsepower, exceeding the output of many bombers of that era. Yet this decision presented an immediate challenge. Such immense power necessitated an equally substantial propeller to translate horsepower into forward momentum. The Hamilton Standard 3-blade propeller, Basel selected, measured 13 feet 4 inches in diameter, larger in span than many fighter aircraft were in height. This gave rise to what engineers term the ground clearance issue. How could such a vast propeller be mounted on a carrier-based fighter without rendering the landing gear impossibly long and fragile? Basel's solution was as ingenious as it was elegant. Instead of attaching straight wings high on the fuselage, he devised what became known as inverted gull wings. The wings angled sharply downwards from the fuselage, then curved back upwards towards their tips. This distinctive configuration afforded the propeller adequate ground clearance while enabling the landing gear to remain relatively short and robust enough to withstand the violent impacts of carrier landings. The result was an aircraft unlike any other in the sky. When viewed from the front, the F4U's bent wings gave it an almost bat-like silhouette, instantly recognizable from miles away. Some pilots would later quip that it resembled an attempt to fold an airplane's wings while it was still airborne. On May 29, 1940, test pilot Lyman Bullard entered the cockpit of the XF4U-1 prototype for its inaugural flight. What transpired next sent ripples of astonishment through the aviation community. The Corsair did not merely fly, it shattered existing records. In level flight, it became the first single-engine American fighter to surpass 400 miles per hour, reaching an astonishing 405 miles per hour over a measured course between Stratford and Hartford, Connecticut. In a dive, test pilots pushed the aircraft to 550 miles per hour before structural stresses compelled them to pull back. The U.S. Navy was convinced. On June 30, 1941, they awarded Vought a contract for 584 F4U-1 fighters, bestowing upon the aircraft the designation Corsair, inherited from an earlier Vought biplane scout from the late 1920s. However, As the initial production Corsairs began to roll off the assembly line in 1942, challenges emerged that would postpone the aircraft's carrier debut and inadvertently alter the trajectory of Marine Corps aviation indefinitely. The very same long nose that housed the powerful engine created significant visibility issues for pilots, particularly during the critical moments of takeoff and landing. When positioned in the typical nose-high attitude for carrier landings, pilots were literally unable to see the flight deck ahead of them. Even more concerning, the Corsair exhibited perilous landing characteristics. The aircraft possessed a tendency to stall unpredictably, with one wing dropping abruptly, a potentially fatal trait when approaching a carrier deck at sea. The potent engine and large propeller generated tremendous torque that could send an inexperienced pilot into an irrecoverable spin. Early test pilots bestowed upon the F4U the nicknames NN Eliminator and Bentwing Widowmaker, reflecting the skill required to master its demanding flight dynamics. Confronted with these difficulties, the Navy made a pivotal decision. Rather than delay carrier operations while engineers resolved the issues, they opted to assign the Corsair to the Marine Corps for land-based operations and adopt the more docile Grumman F6F Hellcat as their primary carrier fighter. This decision, stemming from practical necessity, would prove to be one of the most fortuitous accidents in military aviation history. By early 1943, Marine fighter squadrons in the Pacific were still equipped with the outclassed Grumman F4F Wildcat, a stubby, barrel-shaped fighter that had performed commendably in the early days of the war, but was increasingly outmatched by newer Japanese aircraft. The Marines were in desperate need of a machine capable of intercepting high-altitude Japanese bombers and engaging in dogfights with the legendary Zero fighter. On February 12, 1943, 12 F4U-1s from Marine Fighting Squadron, or FIV, MF-124, landed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The timing could not have been more opportune. The Solomon Islands campaign was entering its most crucial phase, with Japanese and American forces locked in a fierce struggle for control of the island chain. In the air, the conflict had become increasingly desperate as both sides committed their full resources to the fight for aerial supremacy. Marine pilots gathering around the new Corsairs were initially apprehensive. The aircraft looked alien compared to their familiar Wildcats. The cockpit was positioned far back on the fuselage, 32 inches further aft than in the prototype, contributing to that distinctive long-nose profile. The massive engine occupied so much space that fuel had to be stored in the fuselage forward of the cockpit, rather than in the wings as was customary. Every aspect of the aircraft seemed oversized and overpowered. However, when the Marines fired up those Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engines for the first time, skepticism began to yield to exhilaration. The sound was unlike anything they had ever experienced, a deep rumbling roar that conveyed a sense of barely restrained power. When they pushed the throttles forward for takeoff, the Corsairs surged into the air with an acceleration that left Wildcat pilots in awe. 2 days after their arrival, on February 14th, the Marines experienced their initial taste of combat in their new mounts. The mission was to escort a formation of consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers on a raid against the Japanese airfield at Kahili on Bougainville. As the formation neared its target, Japanese Zeros scrambled to intercept, setting the stage for what would become the first significant trial of the F4U in aerial combat. The Japanese pilots who rose to confront the Americans that day were not novice aviators. These were seasoned flyers who had been engaged in combat in the Pacific since the war's earliest days. They had encountered every type of American fighter and had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit each aircraft's vulnerabilities. Against the slow-turning Wildcats, they employed their superior maneuverability to force dogfights at low speeds and altitudes, where the Japanese aircraft's lightness and excellent control response granted them decisive advantages. As the Zeros closed in on the American formation, their pilots anticipated another familiar engagement. They intended to utilize their superior rate of climb to gain an altitude advantage, then dive to disrupt the bomber formation before engaging the escort fighters in turning combat, where their aircraft's agility would prove paramount. It was a proven strategy that had yielded success countless times before. Yet, as the first Zeros dove towards the formation, The Corsair pilots executed an unexpected maneuver. Instead of turning to meet the attack as Wildcat pilots would have done, they advanced their throttles and accelerated away from the Japanese fighters. The Zeros, committed to their diving attacks, found themselves unable to close the distance as the bent-wing fighters simply outran them. Subsequently, having established their speed advantage, the Corsairs turned back towards the Japanese formation. What unfolded next would be replicated thousands of times throughout the remaining years of the war. The F4US utilized their superior speed and power to dictate the terms of engagement, attacking when and where they chose, while denying the enemy the low-speed turning contests in which the Zero excelled. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying his maiden combat mission in a Corsair, found himself face-to-face with a veteran Zero pilot. The Japanese fighter executed a tight turn, attempting to bring its guns to bear. However, Walsh had been briefed on the new tactics devised specifically for the F4U. Instead of attempting to turn with the enemy fighter, he employed his speed advantage to disengage from the combat, then climbed above his opponent before diving back down for another pass. The 650 caliber machine guns mounted in the Corsair's wings, each carried between 375 and 400 rounds of ammunition. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, they unleashed a devastating barrage of lead capable of shredding even heavily armored aircraft. The Japanese Zero, constructed for speed and agility rather than resilience, proved particularly vulnerable to this level of firepower. As Walsh's guns found their mark, the Zero's lightweight construction became a liability rather than an asset. The 50 caliber rounds, each nearly half an inch in diameter and traveling at over 2,700 feet per second, pierced the aircraft's thin aluminum skin as if it were paper. Fuel tanks erupted into flames, control cables snapped, and structural components shattered under the impact of the heavy projectiles. The engagement lasted mere seconds, but its outcome was decisive. The Zero, its pilot likely felled by the initial burst of fire, spiraled earthward, trailing smoke and flame. Walsh had achieved his inaugural victory in the new fighter, but more crucially, he had demonstrated the tactics that would elevate the Corsair to the status of the most successful American fighter of the Pacific War. By the conclusion of that initial engagement, the Marines had lost 2 Corsairs, but they had acquired invaluable insights into effectively piloting their new aircraft. The F4U's advantages were manifest. It was faster than any Japanese aircraft, possessed a superior climb rate compared to the Zero at medium and high altitudes, and could outdive any enemy fighter. Its robust construction meant it could absorb battle damage that would have destroyed a Zero and still return its pilots safely to base. Perhaps most significantly, however, the Corsair's 650 caliber machine guns provided a decisive edge in firepower. Whereas the Zero relied on a combination of machine guns and slower firing cannons, the F4U could discharge nearly 30 pounds of bullets per second when all 6 guns were firing. The 2,300 rounds carried by each Corsair provided just under 30 seconds of continuous fire, more than sufficient to destroy multiple enemy aircraft in a single engagement. News of the Corsair's capabilities spread rapidly through both American and Japanese ranks. For the Americans, it signaled the commencement of a new phase in the air war, one in which they would no longer be compelled to fight defensively against superior enemy aircraft. For the Japanese, the appearance of the F4U marked the beginning of the end of their aerial dominance in the Pacific. Japanese intelligence reports from early 1943 depict a growing apprehension regarding the new American fighter. Pilots who had survived encounters with Corsairs reported that the bent-wing fighters were faster than anything they had previously faced, more heavily armed than the Wildcats, and seemingly immune to battle damage that would have incapacitated their lighter aircraft. However, ingrained habits die hard, and many Japanese pilots initially refused to believe that the Americans had finally produced a fighter superior to their esteemed Zero. The Mitsubishi A-6M had reigned supreme in the Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. Its exceptional range, outstanding maneuverability, and proven combat record had established it as the symbol of Japanese aerial might. Surely this peculiar new American aircraft, with its awkward appearance and unusual wing configuration, could not seriously challenge the Zero's supremacy. This conviction would prove not only misplaced, but catastrophically costly. As more Corsair squadrons entered combat in the spring of 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific skies began to shift dramatically. Marine pilots, liberated from the defensive mindset imposed by flying inferior aircraft, commenced developing aggressive new tactics that capitalized on every advantage their formidable new fighters offered. Lieutenant Walsh, having experienced victory on his first Corsair mission, rapidly emerged as a prominent proponent of these novel tactics. Rather than awaiting enemy advances, Corsair pilots began actively seeking out Japanese formations, employing their superior speed to position themselves for devastating high-speed assaults. They would ascend above enemy formations, dive at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, unleash their 650 caliber guns upon the tightly packed Japanese aircraft, and then extend away before the enemy could retaliate. These tactics, subsequently formalized as boom and zoom attacks, played to every strength of the F4U while mitigating its few weaknesses. The Corsair's exceptional high-altitude performance enabled it to frequently ascend above Japanese formations. Its outstanding dive capabilities facilitated devastating high-speed engagements. Its superior firepower ensured that even brief firing opportunities could prove decisive, and its robust construction provided a margin of safety that permitted pilots to undertake risks that would have been suicidal in earlier American fighters. By April of 1943, a mere 2 months after the first Corsair's arrival in the Pacific, the impact was becoming undeniable. On April 7th, radar stations detected a large formation of Japanese aircraft heading towards the Russell Islands, a pair of small atolls located approximately 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The American response was swift and overwhelming. 76 fighters, comprising Army P-38s and P-39s alongside Marine F-4Fs and the new F-4Us, rose to confront the threat. The ensuing aerial engagement became recognized as one of the largest air battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. When the dust settled, 39 Japanese aircraft had been downed, while American losses were minimal. Corsair pilots were credited with a substantial portion of these victories, demonstrating that their aircraft was not merely capable of holding its own against the Zero, but was demonstrably superior in most combat scenarios. However, the true validation of the F4U's capabilities emerged from individual pilot achievements. In May 1943, Lieutenant Walsh attained ace status by downing 3 Zeros in a single engagement, bringing his total to 6 victories. The ease with which he achieved these kills indicated that the previously feared Zero was no longer superior to American naval fighters when those fighters were piloted with appropriate tactics. The psychological ramifications of these triumphs extended far beyond their tactical significance. For nearly 2 years, American pilots in the Pacific had fought with the awareness that their aircraft were inferior to those of their adversaries. They had relied on courage, teamwork, and superior strategy to surmount technological disadvantages. The arrival of the Corsair marked the first occasion since Pearl Harbor that American pilots could enter their cockpits knowing they were flying the superior machine. This newfound confidence was reflected in combat outcomes. By August 1943, Walsh had become a double ace with 10 confirmed victories. Other Corsair pilots achieved comparable success, and the cumulative effect was devastating for Japanese air power in the Solomons. Experienced enemy aviators, the very backbone of Japanese naval aviation, were being shot down at a rate exceeding their replacement capacity. The Japanese military's reaction to the Corsair threat evolved gradually, hindered by the same institutional pride that had initially dismissed the new American fighter. Reports from the front lines described an aircraft capable of outfighting the Zero in nearly every aspect of aerial combat. Yet, these reports contradicted years of Japanese propaganda, proclaiming the invincibility of their fighters and the supposed inferiority of American aviation technology. Some Japanese commanders attempted to adapt their strategies to counter the Corsair's advantages, emphasizing low-altitude engagements, where the Zero's superior maneuverability might still offer an edge. Others focused on evading combat with the F4Us altogether, preferring to engage older American aircraft types that remained in service. However, these adjustments proved to be too late and too limited to significantly alter the course of the air war. By the autumn of 1943, the transformation was complete. The very same Japanese pilots who had initially derided the ungainly bent-wing fighter now spoke of it with grudging admiration and mounting apprehension. Combat reports from Japanese units characterized the F4U as a formidable adversary that necessitated extreme caution for successful engagement. The aircraft that had appeared so awkward and experimental mere months earlier had evolved into the most feared fighter in the Pacific. The myth of zero invincibility, meticulously constructed by Japanese propaganda and reluctantly accepted by American forces during the bleak early days of the war, lay shattered amidst the wreckage of downed Japanese fighters strewn across the islands of the South Pacific. In its place emerged a new reality: American technological and industrial superiority, personified by the distinctive bent wings and thunderous engine of the F4U Corsair. But this was merely the prelude. As more Marine squadrons transitioned to the Corsair and began devising increasingly sophisticated tactics for deploying their new weapon, the air war in the Pacific was poised to enter an even more decisive phase. The Japanese High Command, finally compelled to acknowledge the threat posed by the F4U, would be forced to implement desperate modifications to their aviation strategy. And in the skies above islands bearing names such as Bougainville, New Georgia, and Rabaul, the ultimate test of the Corsair's capabilities was yet to unfold. September 16, 1943. Bougainville Island, Northern Solomons. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington banks his F4U Corsair into a sweeping turn. 24 more bent-wing fighters follow in a loose formation behind him. Below lies the Japanese airfield at Kahili, resembling a hornet's nest, and Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron has arrived to provoke trouble. What transpires in the ensuing 30 minutes will become one of the most decisive air battles of the Pacific War and solidify the Corsair's reputation as the aircraft that shattered Japanese air power in the South Pacific. The man leading this mission was himself a living testament to the contradiction of conventional military wisdom. At the age of 31, Gregory "Pappy" Boyington was considered seasoned, even aged, by the stringent standards of fighter aviation. His combat experience was extensive. He had previously served with the renowned Flying Tigers in China, where he had been credited with downing 6 Japanese aircraft, before his return to the United States in 1942. Officially, he was deemed too old, too seasoned, and too independent to be an effective leader for young Marine pilots entering combat. Unofficially, however, he embodied precisely the kind of aggressive, unconventional aviator that the Corsair squadrons desperately required. Boyington assumed command of Marine Fighting Squadron VMF 214 in August of 1943, inheriting a unit equipped with the latest F4 U1A models. These enhanced Corsairs boasted improved canopy visibility, more potent engines incorporating water injection systems, and refined flight characteristics that rendered them even more formidable in battle. Under Boyington's leadership, the unit, nicknamed the Black Sheep, had already achieved an impressive feat, downing 23 Japanese aircraft within their initial 2 weeks of operations. Today, their sights were set on even more significant targets. As the Corsair circled at 20,000 feet above Bougainville, Boyington could clearly discern the Japanese airfield spread out below, resembling a meticulously detailed map. Intelligence reports indicated that as many as 60 enemy aircraft were stationed at Kahili, comprising a mix of Zeros, bombers, and newer fighter models that the Japanese were urgently trying to deploy. The American strategy was characteristically straightforward: fly over the enemy airfield in plain view, provoke the Japanese into scrambling their fighters, and then engage and destroy them in aerial combat. This maneuver, known as a fighter sweep, had become the hallmark of Corsair operations during the latter half of 1943. In contrast to the defensive missions that had characterized earlier American air engagements, the F4U's superior performance allowed Marine pilots to dictate the terms of combat. They could choose when to fight, where to fight, and crucially, when to disengage if the tactical situation became unfavorable. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. As the Black Sheep maintained their leisurely orbits above the airfield, the first enemy fighters began to lift off from Kahili's runways, followed swiftly by more and more. Within minutes, an estimated 60 Japanese aircraft were ascending towards the 24 Corsairs, representing the largest single enemy formation most of the American pilots had ever encountered. For the Japanese pilots scrambling to meet this challenge, the sight of the distinctive, bent-winged American fighters must have evoked a potent combination of anticipation and apprehension. By September of 1943, the F4U was no longer an unknown entity. Japanese intelligence had compiled thorough reports detailing the Corsair's capabilities, and seasoned enemy pilots had learned to approach engagements with the American fighter with extreme caution. However, a ratio of 60 to 24 appeared to favor the Japanese, particularly if they could lure the Americans into low altitude, turning dogfights where the Zero's superior maneuverability might still confer an advantage. As the enemy formation climbed towards the Corsairs, the stage was set for one of the most significant aerial confrontations of the Solomon Islands campaign. Observing the enemy fighters ascend towards his formation, Boyington made a critical strategic decision that would define the engagement. Instead of maintaining their altitude and forcing the Japanese to climb to them, the tactically sound choice, he ordered his Corsairs to descend and meet the enemy midway. This decision deviated from standard doctrine, but underscored the growing confidence of American pilots in their aircraft's formidable capabilities. The ensuing aerial engagement evolved into a masterful display of tactical utilization of superior technology. As the two formations converged, the Corsairs leveraged their speed advantage to control the encounter. Rather than becoming embroiled in a sprawling dogfight, where sheer numbers might have favored the Japanese, the F4U broke into smaller, coordinated units that could execute attacks while retaining the flexibility to disengage when necessary. The cacophony of the battle was unlike anything previously heard in the Pacific War. 60 aircraft, their engines pushed to their limits, generated a thunderous roar audible for miles. The staccato bursts of machine guns and cannon fire mingled with the piercing screams of aircraft in high-speed dives, and the occasional explosive bloom of a fuel tank struck by tracer rounds. For the Marines orbiting above Bougainville, this was the sound of American air power finally unleashed without restraint. Lieutenant Robert McClurg, flying as Boyington's wingman, later described the engagement as controlled chaos. The sky seemed alive with aircraft turning, diving, and climbing in constantly shifting patterns. Yet, within this apparent pandemonium, the Corsair's superior performance began to assert itself. While Japanese pilots struggled to match the rapid acceleration and climb rate of the F4Us, American pilots could position themselves for decisive shots with relative ease. The Corsair's battery of 6.50 caliber machine guns proved devastatingly effective against the lightly constructed Japanese fighters. Each gun fired at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute, and when all 6 were synchronized, they could unleash nearly 30 pounds of bullets into the air every second. The impact of this concentrated firepower on the fragile Zero fighters was catastrophic. Marine Sergeant James Sweat, on his 10th combat mission, found himself alone and cornered by 3 Zeros attempting to encircle him for a coordinated attack. In an earlier era of fighter aircraft, such a predicament would have been dire, potentially fatal. However, the F4U's performance envelope offered Sweat options that previous American fighters lacked. He jammed his throttle forward, utilizing the Corsair's superior acceleration to break free of the trap, and then climbed rapidly above his pursuers. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, with its 18 cylinders generating over 2,000 horsepower, pulled the Corsair upward with a ferocity that the Japanese pilots struggled to match. At altitude, Sweat held the advantage of position and energy. He rolled inverted and plunged back towards the 3 Zeros, his speed escalating to over 400 miles per hour as he dove earthward. The ensuing attack lasted mere seconds. Sweat's 6 machine guns, loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, converged on the lead Zero at a range of less than 200 yards. The Japanese fighter, caught in a climbing turn that rendered it vulnerable, virtually disintegrated under the impact of the heavy bullets. Its pilot, likely killed instantly, had no opportunity to react as his aircraft broke apart around him before the other 2 Zeros could respond. Sweat had already overshot them, using his diving speed to increase the distance while repositioning for another attack. This hit-and-run tactic, perfected by Corsair pilots over months of combat, allowed American fighters to engage numerically superior forces without being drawn into disadvantageous situations. Across the battlefield, similar scenarios unfolded as individual Corsair pilots exploited their aircraft's superior performance to engage and destroy enemy fighters. The Japanese formation, which had appeared so menacing as it climbed towards the American aircraft, began to disintegrate under the sustained assault. Aircraft plummeted from the sky, trailing smoke and flames, their pilots either deceased at the controls or struggling with crippled machines that could no longer maneuver effectively. The technological disparity between the two aircraft types became increasingly evident as the battle progressed. While damaged Corsairs could absorb substantial battle damage and continue fighting, even minor hits on a Zero often proved catastrophic. The Japanese emphasis on lightweight construction, which had initially contributed to their fighters' superior range and maneuverability early in the war, now became a fatal liability for their pilots. Captain Donald Aldrich, leading a four-plane section of Corsairs, encountered a formation of 6 Zeros attempting to attack a damaged American bomber struggling to reach friendly territory. The subsequent rescue mission showcased both the Corsairs' capabilities and the tactical sophistication that American pilots had developed in employing their superior aircraft. Rather than immediately diving into the fray, Aldrich positioned his section above and behind the Japanese formation, using the sun to mask their approach. When the attack commenced, it was devastatingly effective. 4 Corsairs, diving at high speed with the sun at their backs, opened fire simultaneously on the unsuspecting Japanese fighters. Within 10 seconds, 3 Zeros were destroyed, and a 4th was so severely damaged that its pilot was forced to break off his attack on the bomber. The remaining 2 Japanese pilots, suddenly outnumbered and outgunned, attempted to escape by diving towards the ocean surface, where they hoped the Corsair's superior high-altitude performance would be less decisive. However, the F4U's excellent dive characteristics meant it could pursue enemy aircraft even into their preferred low-altitude domain. Both Zeros were shot down before they could reach the relative safety of their home airfield. As the aerial battle over Bougainville raged on, the cumulative effect of superior American technology and tactics became undeniable. What had begun as an engagement of 60 against 24 rapidly devolved into a rout. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky faster than their comrades could count, while American losses remained minimal. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese pilots was profound. Many would later report that the engagement convinced them the air war was lost. By the time the final shots were fired, 20 Japanese aircraft lay scattered across the waters surrounding Bougainville. Not a single Corsair had been lost to enemy action, though several bore battle damage that bore testament to the intensity of the engagement. For the Black Sheep Squadron, it represented their most successful mission to date. For Japanese air power in the Solomons, it marked the beginning of the end. Major Boyington, his aircraft's guns depleted and fuel running low, led his formation home to their base at Vella La Vella. Behind them, the smoke from burning aircraft marked the scene of what would be remembered as one of the most lopsided air battles of the Pacific War. The Japanese would continue to fight, but their ability to challenge American air superiority had been irrevocably broken over the waters of Bougainville Sound. The impact of engagements like this extended far beyond their immediate tactical outcomes. Each successful Corsair mission bolstered American confidence while simultaneously eroding the Japanese morale. Veteran enemy pilots, the irreplaceable backbone of Japanese naval aviation, were being eliminated at a rate that made their replacement impossible. Training programs that had once produced skilled aviators were now rushed endeavors, sending barely competent pilots into combat against increasingly experienced American adversaries flying superior aircraft. The technological chasm between the F4U and Japanese fighters continued to widen as American industry produced enhanced versions of the Corsair, while Japanese aircraft development stagnated under the pressures of wartime resource shortages. The F4U 1D variant, introduced in April of 1944, featured an even more powerful engine with water injection, boosting output to over 2,400 horsepower. Its speed increased to 425 miles per hour, and its already impressive climb rate improved further. More significantly, the new variant incorporated lessons learned from months of combat operations. Visibility was enhanced, handling characteristics were refined, and weapon systems were optimized for maximum effectiveness. Where early Corsairs had been powerful but demanding to fly, the later variants were both more capable and more forgiving of pilot error. The psychological warfare aspect of the F4U's reputation became almost as critical as its actual combat effectiveness. Japanese pilots, hearing tales of the destruction wrought by the bent-wing fighters, began to approach combat with a defensive mindset that often proved self-fulfilling. The aggressive tactics that had served Japanese aviation so well in the early war yielded to cautious approaches that played directly into American strengths. By early 1944, the transformation was complete. The Corsair had evolved from a promising yet problematic fighter into the dominant aircraft of the Pacific War. Its kill ratio against Japanese opponents approached 12-1 in some theaters, a level of superiority unprecedented in aerial warfare. Over 2,000 enemy aircraft would fall to Corsair guns before the war's conclusion, while fewer than 200 F4Us were lost to enemy action. The human cost of this technological superiority was profound. Japanese pilot training programs, once the envy of the world, could no longer produce aviators capable of matching American skill and equipment. Experienced enemy pilots, those who had honed their trade in the campaigns of 1941 and 1942, were being eliminated faster than they could impart their knowledge to new generations of flyers. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Spears, commanding Marine Aircraft Group 14, summarized this transformation in a report to headquarters. The arrival of the F4U has fundamentally altered the character of air combat in this theater. Where our pilots once fought defensively, hoping to survive encounters with superior enemy aircraft, they now seek out combat with the confidence that their equipment gives them decisive advantages. The psychological impact of this change cannot be overstated. Udo, but perhaps the most telling evidence of the Corsair's impact, came from Japanese sources. Captured documents from late 1943 and early 1944 revealed that enemy commanders were increasingly reluctant to commit their remaining experienced pilots against American formations, known to include F4US. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as an awkward experiment had become so feared that its mere presence could alter Japanese tactical planning. The strategic implications of American air superiority, built on the foundation of Corsair dominance, rippled throughout the Pacific War. Japanese plans that had once assumed at least local air superiority now had to account for American air power that could strike anywhere, at any time. Supply lines became vulnerable, troop movements hazardous, and defensive positions exposed to constant attack from aircraft that Japanese fighters could no longer effectively intercept. As 1944 dawned, the air war in the Pacific had been fundamentally transformed. The Japanese, who had initiated the conflict with arguably the world's most advanced naval aviation forces, found themselves flying obsolescent aircraft with inadequately trained pilots against an adversary possessing both technological and numerical superiority. The Corsair, more than any other single factor, had made this transformation possible. The bent-wing fighter that Japanese pilots had once viewed with amusement had become the instrument of their aerial defeat. Its 50-caliber machine guns, thundering engine, and distinctive silhouette had become symbols of American technological and industrial might. In the hands of increasingly skilled Marine and Navy pilots, it represented a weapon system so effective that it would continue to dominate Pacific skies until the war's end. The laughter of those early Japanese pilots, confident in their Zero's superiority and dismissive of American engineering, had been silenced forever in the skies above islands whose names would be forever associated with American air power. Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Rabaul, and dozens of others where the distinctive whistle of air through the Corsair's engine intakes had become the sound of approaching victory. In the end, the F4U Corsair had proven that in warfare, as in engineering, appearances could indeed be deceiving. The ungainly fighter with bent wings and an oversized engine had become one of the most successful combat aircraft in history, its legacy written in the wreckage of enemy fighters scattered across thousands of square miles of the Pacific Ocean. Those who had laughed at its unusual configuration would never have the chance to laugh again.